In this video, we'll look at John Stuart Mill's competing theory of normative ethics. When I say competing, I mean competing with Kant's. So Mill and Kant agree on some points, but they also disagree rather importantly on others. So again, this is a continuation of our investigation into normative ethics, which tries to identify the guidelines, the most general moral rules or guidelines that govern action. Okay, so here's a rough sketch of what we'll look at with Mill. So let's start with his anatomy of action. This is basically going to mirror Kant exactly. So we have someone on the left side of the screen here, and she wants to get to the other side. She thinks, if I want that, then I should walk, and this leads her to walk to the other side of the screen. Kant called the thing on the left the desire or inclination, or the material part of the maxim. Mill calls it the desire. Kant called the thing here the rule or principle, or the formal part of the maxim. We'll just call it the rule because that's what Mill calls it. And Kant called this the purpose of the goal, and Mill calls it the end. But really, it's the same three parts: desire, rule, and end. Mill agrees that moral worth comes from action, so that's an important point of agreement with Kant. And Mill agrees that these are the three components of action, and therefore moral worth must come from one of them. That's another important point of agreement with Kant. Kant goes from there and argues as follows. So this is Kant now. Kant says, look, moral worth can't come from the end, because an action can be morally praiseworthy even if the end isn't achieved, as when, say, a firefighter runs into a burning building to save a baby and then gets killed before she manages to save the baby, her action can still be morally praiseworthy. And an action can be morally neutral, that is not praiseworthy, even when the end that's achieved is perfectly good, as when the shopkeeper gives correct change but with bad motivation. Kant argues that the moral worth can't come from the desire because desires aren't freely chosen, and morality necessarily involves freedom. Desires, he thinks, are purely mechanistic. So he concludes moral worth must come from the rule. Mill is going to say, no, moral worth comes from the end. And he reasons as follows. He says morality isn't for or directed at anything other than itself. His idea here is that someone who says, like, look, I'm behaving morally in order to achieve this other end, really is missing the point of morality. Morality isn't for some end or directed at something other than itself. It just kind of is. Desires are for an end. They're directed at an end. It doesn't make sense to say you have to desire something. So desire can't be the source of moral worth. And rules, he says, are always directed at an end. The point of a rule is to get you to an end. Now, Kant might disagree with that, but note that that's what Mill says. So moral worth can't come from the rule, so it must come from the end. By contrast, says Mill, ends aren't for anything other than themselves, they just are. Okay, so let's sort of repeat this and do a little more to flesh this out. So Mill actually doesn't say anything about why you should accept number one, that morality isn't for or directed at anything else. But as I said, just think about a case where someone says they're going to do the morally correct thing, but then says they're only doing it for some other reason. It's intuitive to say, well, that's not really a morally valuable action. It's sort of missing the point of morality. So why do we think someone who behaves morally in order to achieve some other goal doesn't really behave morally? We think that she's missing the point of morality, and that indicates that morality isn't for or directed at anything other than itself. Why accept that desires are for the end and rules are always directed at an end? Well, Mill thinks these are obviously true, but here's a little bit of elaboration. Notice the verb desire is transitive. It must take an object. You can't just say I desire. You have to say what it is you desire. Like I desire some water, or I desire this or that. This suggests that desires must be for something. And according to Mill, the whole point of a rule, like if you want a cake, then go bake, or follow the recipe, is to tell us the means to achieve our end. Now, again, Kant might disagree with this. He might say, no, some rules don't merely tell you the means to achieve your end, they command you. But this is what Mill says. And if Mill's right about this, then it makes no sense to have a rule that isn't directed at an end. Okay, so now let's contrast Kant with Mill. They both start out the same way. They both accept that moral worth is a feature of actions. They both accept that actions have three parts, the desire, the rule, and the end, and they both accept that therefore moral worth they then disagree. I should say they both accept that therefore moral worth must come from one of the three parts. Here they disagree. Mill says moral worth doesn't come from the desire or the rule, whereas Kant says moral worth doesn't come from the desire or the end, and this leads to their competing conclusions. Kant saying moral worth comes from the rule, Mill saying moral worth comes from the end. On Mill's view, where moral worth comes from the end, moral worth of an action depends on the consequences, its end, and thus it's called a consequentialist theory. Okay, when we talked about Kant and we concluded that moral worth comes from the rule, we said, hey, look, telling us that moral worth comes from the rule is maybe important, but it doesn't tell us what we really want to know, which is which kind of rule is such that if you follow it, your action is morally praiseworthy, and if you violate it, your action is morally blameworthy. Similarly, when you conclude that moral worth comes from the end, you might say, okay, you've shown us moral worth comes from the end, but what are the right ends? Which ends are the good ones? Mill answers as follows. He says, our ends are whatever we ultimately desire. And somebody might say, but how do we know that? And Mill says, well, it's really easy. We know what's visible because we see it, we know what's audible because we hear it, and we know what's desirable because it's what we desire. Now notice there's kind of a shift here. He's going from a claim about, a purely prescriptive claim about what we in fact desire, to what looks like a prescriptive claim about what's desirable, what's actually good to desire. But that's how he argues. And the person says, so what do we desire? And Mill says, simple, happiness. And this person says, wait, hold on. People seem to desire all sorts of things aside from happiness. And Mill says, yeah, but the desires for other things actually stem from a desire for happiness. So the guy says, look, what about people who just want money even though it doesn't make them happy? And Mill says, well, people initially started seeking money because of its connection to happiness. They thought it could get them things which would make them happy. And then kind of along the way, they lost track of that connection and out of habit started pursuing money for its own sake. But that doesn't indicate that they really think money is a real end in itself. It just indicates that they sort of have fallen into a habit to pursue something that they don't actually value, that they don't actually think is an end in itself. And correspondingly, we can say money only became an end for that person in the first place because it was kind of an intermediate end, not an ultimate end. It was an intermediate end, the idea being achieving money would help you get to happiness. Okay, then Mill just reiterates, the only thing we take to be an end in itself, the only thing we desire for its own sake is happiness. So here now we have an argument. Happiness is the sole end of human action. We judge things only by their ends. So happiness is the sole standard for judging human actions. Well, as Kant says and Mill agrees, only human actions can be right or wrong. Therefore, happiness is the sole criterion of our moral judgments. And then Mill is going to elaborate and say, look, actions are morally better insofar as they increase happiness and morally worse insofar as they decrease happiness. So we can think of moral worth as falling on a continuum from the better to the worse. For any action, the happiness at issue, I should mention, is the total world happiness, not your individual happiness. So when Mill says, increasing happiness is good and decreasing happiness is bad, he doesn't mean increasing happiness, my own happiness is what's good, and in any given moment I should do what will increase my own happiness, and that decreasing my own happiness is bad. Rather, he means increasing happiness for people overall, or animals if they count, for the sort of overall happiness, increasing that is what matters. And decreasing that is what's bad. Okay, that's Mill's theory. I know I went through that quickly. You can pause and sort of think through parts as I went through them. In the next video, we'll look at objections to Mill's theory.